Hi, today is May 31st, 2010, Memorial Day, and we are interviewing Dion Neutra at his home. Cheryl Revkin is the interviewer, and Michael Masterson is the cameraman. Cheryl?
Okay, great. So, Dion, let's start at the beginning. When were you born?
October 8th, 1926.
Were you born in L.A.?
I was born in L.A., Hollywood Presbyterian
Is that
Hospital.
right? At Hollywood Press.
Right.
And you were an only child? Is that right?
I was the second of three children.
Three, I see.
An older brother and then a much younger brother.
Oh, is that right? Three boys.
Three boys, yeah.
And are they with us still?
I was brought, my older brother passed away a couple of years ago. My younger one is still with us. I was brought from the Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital back to the Schindler House, which is where my parents were living.
Where was that located?
In West Hollywood, on Kings Road.
That's the Mac house?
That's the Mac house, yeah.
And how is it that they lived there?
They lived there because my father had been in touch with his classmate Rudolph Schindler over the years, and Schindler had said, "Oh, if you ever get to L.A., you know, you can live with us, and we'll practice together, and we'll do good stuff together and everything." He was telling my dad to come to Los Angeles, and of course the war came, the First World War came in, and then my father ended up spending 2 years in the Austrian cavalry. So he was held up for a while. Schindler came on. He came in 1912 to Los Angeles. My dad made it in 1925.
Oh.
So it was quite a bit later.
Yeah, quite a bit. And did they work together then? Or?
They did work together. They worked together for several years, tried doing various projects. And I think what kind of drove them apart a little bit was the League of Nations competition in 1925, where they both committed to do the work, but then my dad ended up doing most of the work. Schindler was busy with other things and whatever, and my dad was upset about it, but you know, he accepted it. But what happened was that there was an exhibition of the project that happened in Europe after that, and my grandfather, who was in Switzerland, in Zurich at the time, was in charge of the European showings, had picked up on this conflict, and then when he publicized this work, instead of giving Schindler credit, he excluded Schindler's name. And of course that made Schindler mad. My dad was upset because he had not authorized that, but it did cause a problem and some hard feelings, so that was kind of the beginning of the end of that.
So you moved, did you move then out of the house?
Yeah, what happened was my dad decided, well, first of all, he was given the commission to do the Lovell house. Schindler had done several projects for Lovell before, including the Beach House, which is his most famous example. But then Lovell, I think, for whatever reason, probably because Schindler was sort of a womanizer and he had an eye for his wife, thought it was a little awkward to employ him again, hired my father, and that was a further, you know, thing that didn't go over too well with Schindler, I'm sure. After that house was completed, there was a lot of publicity. It was really well publicized by the LA Times. People came to see it. But it was right in the middle of the Depression in 1930, and nobody came to my dad saying, "I want you to design a house," as a result. So he was kind of out of work. He had received many invitations to lecture around the world as a result of that house.
Is that right?
So he decided to do a world tour, take advantage of some of that, and encouraged my mother to take me and my brother to Switzerland to visit with her parents.
Just one brother?
There was two brothers.
You and your brothers?
My brother, yeah. The two of us. We were only 2 years apart, 3 years apart. So we set out through the Panama Canal to go to Switzerland on a freighter.
Wow.
And we're there for 8 months. And actually I learned to speak German almost before I learned to speak English.
How old were you then?
I was like 4.
4 years old?
Yeah.
And you remember the trip?
And I do remember the trip. It was some aspects of it were very memorable. And so my father was on his tour. My mother was visiting her parents, and after we completed that, came back to L.A. is when my dad rented a half of a duplex on Douglas Street. Can we take a break and see what that's about?
Yeah, is somebody... Wait. Okay. Okay.
At some point, I tried to trace the location of the Neutra practice. In fact, I'm writing a book and I have a chapter on where that is. Most people don't know about the Douglas Street period, which was only about a year, where my father leased a half of a duplex there. The building is still there, actually. It's interesting.
It's on Douglas here in Echo Park?
In Echo Park. It's just up towards the park, on the very top of Douglas Street, close to the park.
Yeah. And he had his practice in the house?
And he had his practice there in the house, and he did some of his important urban planning work there, and we called Rush City Reformed, he called it. Interesting choice of title, because we were always in such a rush.
Otherwise, where did the title come from?
I don't know. I think that's probably his thought, was that people were rushing all the time, and he was interested in transportation. So he did a study of what he called urban transfers, where he had a combined rail and bus and auto terminal that he designed, with precursor of many of the transportation systems that came later in our city. Anyway, during that time he had various apprentices that were notable. One of them was Raphael Soriano, architect, and then later Harwell Hamilton Harris, who was also a famous architect, later went to Texas.
They were kind of interning with him?
They were interning during that time, yeah, it's interesting.
And do you remember them being in the house?
I do remember, yeah. In fact, a notable childhood memory was Ain had parked his car on the street down below the house, turned the wheels into the curb, and I, as a youngster of 5 years old, climbed into the car and was pretending to drive and managed to jar the wheels loose, and the car started to roll down.
Oh my God!
With me in it. Crossed the street, hit a fire hydrant, broke the fire hydrant off. It caused the consternation.
Oh, jeez.
And unfortunately stopped the car before it damaged the neighbors or anything. But I always remember that as a highlight of my experience with Gregory Ain. Yeah.
With Gregory Ain, no less.
He was upset. Everybody was upset, obviously, but we survived. It was okay. And it was during that time when Neutra met someone that he had met on his trip to the Netherlands, Cornelius van der Leo, whose father had commissioned him to research the building of a manufacturing plant in Rotterdam. My father had visited the plant and was very impressed by it, and contacted van der Leo, and he in turn came to Los Angeles to see what Neutra was doing. And my dad only had two things to show. He had the Lovell House, and he had an apartment complex called the Jardinet Apartments, which also still exists.
And what part of town are they?
It's on west of Western and north of Melrose, on a street called Marathon. It's now been converted into a Hispanic complex with all the colors have been changed, and it looks pretty bad, but the bones are still there. It could be restored.
And this was in the 1930s?
This was in early 1930s that he did that project. And then also the health house. So there were just those two buildings that he could show, and van der Leo said to him, well, why don't you design your own house? That's always a good chance for an architect to experiment and do your own thing. Well, I don't have the money to do that. I couldn't possibly consider, well, how much money would it take? Well, he didn't know. He reached for a number. He said $3,500.
Oh my God.
And the man said, well, no problem. So he wrote a check for $3,500 and said, You can pay me back whenever you can, and I think this is an important venture. You should do this. Well, my father had forgotten that you have to buy a lot first before you can build the house, and he hadn't really selected a site. So he looked around and he found a spot on Silver Lake Boulevard, half a block north of here, which faced the lake and was very reminiscent of his time in Switzerland. It reminded him of it. And the lake, of course, was an urban, an unusual thing for urban downtown LA. So he thought it was a great location, and of course it was 10 minutes from downtown, and it was sort of centrally located. He thought it was a great idea.
We're speaking of the VDL house, right?
And that became the VDL house, and that stands for Vandeleo. That's the name.
Oh,
of
Vandeleo.
And the guy who had given the money. So because he had to spend $1,000 of his $3,500 budget to buy the lot, he was down to too small an amount to actually build a house. So the only way he could get it done was to get people to participate. He got a lot of people to be willing to put their things in, at cost or at no cost, and therefore got it put together that he was able to build the first version of the VDL house. So that was in 1932, and so we then were able to move from our location in Douglas Street to that site about a year later, and I remember living there and moving in there and everything about that. That was very interesting.
Now, were you just starting school then? Did you go to school here in
Yes,
Silver Lake?
I went to school here in Silver Lake. I actually went to 3 different elementary schools. I went to the school over on
Clifford Street?
Clifford Street was one, and then the other one was Ivanhoe. But before that, even in my kindergarten, I went to what's the name of the school over on in Echo Park?
Yeah, Betty Placentia School on Temple and Glendale Boulevard?
No, this was on parallel with Glendale Boulevard.
Oh, Logan Street?
Logan Street School. That's where I went to for my kindergarten.
Oh, really? Wow.
So I attended all the neighborhood schools here.
I see.
And later went to King and Marshall as well. So I went to all those different schools.
So what's your first recollection of Silver Lake? There probably were many fewer homes, right?
Yeah, it was very much less densely. In fact, there's a historic photograph of me and my mother on the roof of the VDL house with the other side of the lake in view, and you could see there's hardly any houses over there. It's kind of bare. And I later reprised that shot 50 years later with my mother on the roof again, taking the same shot again. So you now see it changes. And but many things had happened, including the fact that the lake got moved back from where it was originally. Used to come right to the street. Later was moved far back. So when we rebuilt the house after a fire in 1963, we decided to try to bring the water into the site, sort of a memory of that.
I see.
Then I think I showed you the plans for my memorial park for my father, where the idea is to bring the water again historically close to the site, so that it would recall the original connection that site had with the lake.
Do you still have that board with your plan?
No, I looked for it. I've got one that's similar to it. I don't know where the color one went. We had a color one on display, and now I've misplaced it.
We could shoot it later when you find it.
Yeah, we'll find it. But
And I wonder if you have photos, those 2 photos of you and your mother at 2 different times. That would be great to put together with the meadow.
That would be good. Yeah, I don't have that handy, but we can work
Find
on
them
getting
maybe.
it. Yeah.
What was your mother's background? You said her parents lived in Germany?
She was actually German-born, but she lived most of her life in Zurich, Switzerland, and her parents were also transports from Germany, but lived there for many years. And actually, I studied. After having visited there in 1930, I came back again in my junior year and spent a year in Switzerland.
Your junior year of college?
Junior year of college, studying at the ETH, is their Swiss Federal Institution of Technology, where architecture is taught. So that's where I spent my junior year.
So this was well after the war,
This
right?
was well after the war, yes. This was right after the war, actually, in 1947, 46, and
Really?
47.
Is that right? You were there for a year.
I was there for a year. I traveled around. I had relatives in Germany that I visited and in France. And so I got to visit those. And then I traveled extensively in Italy for a month. So it was really wonderful because, you know, as a student, you're studying history of architecture out of books, but here I was able to go and actually see the stuff in person and experience what it was like to go through the buildings.
But Europe was kind of in shambles at the time, I can imagine.
It was. I remember visiting relatives in Germany, in Augsburg, and as a special treat to me, they gave me their monthly allotment for meat. You got a coupon and you could trade it in at the store, and they got one slice of bologna. That was the monthly allotment for a whole family at that time.
And they gave it to you as a guest?
They gave it to me as a guest, yeah.
Wow.
It was very touching.
Very generous of them.
So
Did you talk about the war at all? That you
Oh yeah, we did. I mean, of course we couldn't, it was kind of a difficult subject because being Germans, they tried to distance themselves from the Nazi policies and everything, you know, and it was very very delicate because people there were kind of snookered into this whole thing. They didn't really realize what was happening until it was way too late, and then later, with the whole Jewish thing was all kept under wraps, you didn't really know what was happening. And then suddenly to find out that all these people had been exterminated, it was a shock for people. But we managed to skirt those issues and talk about other things. And these were relatives on my mother's side. Her aunt, the daughter of her aunt, had married and had 2 children, and I've been in touch with them ever since. Especially the daughter is now in her late 60s, and has her children as well. So we visited there and attended weddings of theirs. They now have children of their own, and so it's a nice connection. They live in Mannheim, Germany.
I see. And did your mother and her family move to Switzerland for political reasons or for work, or?
I don't know. I don't remember what the reason was, but my grandfather was an engineer. He had an unusual specialty. He visited various communities and helped them make the switch to gas heating. So the whole infrastructure of installing gas piping under the streets and bringing it to the houses was part of what he helped people to do at that time, because in those days it was still kerosene lighting and electricity was just getting started at that time in the beginning of the century. And so that was his specialty, and he would travel around actually mostly in Germany, even though he was stationed in Zurich.
Switzerland.
So that's what he did. And my grandmother ran a kind of a boarding house where she had paying guests, you know, coming in, like a bed and breakfast kind of atmosphere. And I remember experiencing many of those people in those days, guests. And then what happened was my father was in the service during the war, and then when he came back from the service he had malaria, and he was recovering from that. So the only place in Europe that was still intact, so to speak, was Switzerland. So he managed to get a chance to go to Switzerland and go to a kind of a rest home that was on Lake Zurich. I don't know how he got there, made the connection to get there, but that's where he ended up. And my aunt, my mother's younger sister, was there. She was studying to be a nurse's aide, and she was doing an internship with this lady who ran this at Oldhamsheim, they called it, like a nursing home. And she met this young dashing officer who still had his uniform on from the artillery because he couldn't afford to buy clothes. So he wore his uniform and was very erect, and looked very militaristic to her and very different from anything she'd ever seen before. And she was immediately struck by him and said to her mother, "You have to invite this man to home because he's so unusual." And her mother said, "Well, why? What's so unusual about him?" "Oh, well, he's just so incredible." Anyway, so she talked her mother into inviting him, and then he got to meet my mother, who was the older of the 4 sisters. And they clicked, you know, right away in some way. The other 2 sisters were impressed, but not that impressed with him. And I had an interesting experience many years later. In fact, my mother was already in her 80s, and her sister was also 80, and they had visited from Switzerland, and we're all together. And this was about 1980 something. And the girl I was going with at the time was a kind of a camera buff person. She and her boyfriend had shot a movie, and she said to me, "You should get these women on camera while they're together. You know, how do we know they'll ever be together again?" So I'd never thought of that idea, but I thought, yeah, it's already a good idea. So I put together a quick menu of things to talk about on camera, and we did it on a Saturday morning. I remember one of the questions I asked the women was, "Well, what was your first impression of Richard Neutra when you first met him?" This is going back 60, 70 years ago. And it was so interesting to get the different angles from these different people, you know.
Sure.
Completely different viewpoints of my dad. The second sister said, "Well, I thought he was attractive, but I said I could never deal with somebody that's so detail-oriented. I could see that he was way too, you know, tied up in details, and it would be too uncomfortable for me." Things like that. So I got things on camera that were really unusual because of that. But anyway,
Yeah.
so we're talking about.
Well, yeah, let's go. Well, I was
we
curious
go.
how your parents met, but you just explained that, I guess.
Yeah.
And,
so they met that way, and then so at first there was he had no prospects because he was, you know, he was a war veteran. He didn't have any income. He got a job as a gardener's assistant at a nursery. That was the first job that he really could get, and he certainly had no prospects to be able to support anybody in a marriage, so that was sort of not possible. But they did get talking, they started to talk about getting married pretty early on in their relationship, just putting it off until we could figure out where are we going to get the money to do this. Meanwhile, the parents were trying to sort of get their daughter separated to maybe get some perspective on this. They sent her to Vienna to study cello with a teacher that they had lined up for her. She was a cellist and had ambitions to actually be a professional player. So she went to Vienna. Well, of course, they didn't realize that my father's parents were in Vienna, and he had lots of relatives there, so he had plenty of reason to go there to check it out with her. And so they had a reunion in Vienna, and you know, things got more and more complicated, and finally it got to the point where, well, yes, we're going to get married. Well, the problem was that my grandparents were actually Catholic. I mean, that was my grandmother's religion, and they went to a Catholic church, and they would have to post the banns on the door that they were going to get married. And this turns out that my father was Jewish, and this was an embarrassment for them to have to put this information on the door of the church. So I remember my mother saying to them, you know, if that's embarrassing to you, we'll simply go to the justice of the peace and you get married. We don't have to disturb your religious preferences and everything. They finally what happened was they got married in Germany, of all things. I forgot exactly why. I think it was because my father by that time had been invited to come to Berlin to work with Erich Mendelsohn, architect. He had.
This is in the early 30s?
This was in 1929
or something?
Or something.
Oh,
like
21.
21.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
My father, when he was in school, had been a school fellow of Ernst Freud, who was the son of Sigmund Freud. And so my father would hobnob in the Freud household, you know, visiting his friend, and got to know Sigmund pretty well. And Ernst Freud was working in Berlin at an architect's office and heard about this situation with Mendelssohn. And so he talked to my father about it, and that sounded interesting. So he decided to go and seek his fortune in Berlin. And that's how, and invited my mother to come along somehow. I think she lived with him in an apartment there for a while before they got married. And somehow they ended up getting married in a very small town, whose name I can't think of right now, but it's only a 20-minute ride from Herford, where we were at this opening.
I see. Yeah.
It's called Hagen, Germany.
Hagen.
Hagen. Yeah, and so that's where they got married, more or less at the Justice of the Peace.
And it wasn't a problem for either family for your mother to immigrate to the States and set up life over here?
It became a problem in the sense that my father decided to make the change after he worked with Mendelssohn for a while, and then, I don't know, the work tapered off or whatever, and he says, well, now it's time for me, I got to make my plans to go to make the big switch. He'd been thinking about it for years. So he managed to get a visa and left in 1923 for the United States. My mother, at that point, was pregnant with the first baby, and so they decided it was best for her to have the baby with her mother as support, and then follow later on, you know, the next year or so to come on to the United States. So that was the plan. So my mother showed up the next year in Bremen or wherever the port was to leave, and showed her papers, and the man said, well, that's all well and good, where's the child's visa? She says, well, I don't need a visa for my child. He's only 3 months old. Sorry, you do need a visa for the child, and what's further is that the visa, the allotment is closed. You cannot get a visa for the next 6 months. You have to wait until the next slot opens, and then you can apply for a visa. So my mother's standing on the dock with her mother and her baby, and she says to her mother, here, take this baby, I'm going to the United States.
Oh, you're kidding. She left without your brother?
A 3-month-old baby she handed to her mother and says, you take care of this baby. I'm heading for the United States, and then as soon as you can get the visa, you can bring the baby. We'll reunion in the United States. So this is an emblematic of my mother's
relationship,
motherhood tendencies.
And was it 6 months or was it longer?
It was 6 months. Yeah, she managed to. The grandmother got the visa and famously reunited. By that time, my father had worked in New York for a while. He had gone to Chicago and worked for a while. There he met Frank Lloyd Wright. He wanted to work with Wright. Wright invited him to come, but he wasn't there very busy, and so he could only keep my father there for a few months. But famously, that's where my grandmother came with the reunion. There's a picture of Wright, my grandmother, the baby, and my parents all sitting around in Wright's living room.
In Chicago?
In Spring Green. Which is Taliesin East. Right. That's where Frank Lloyd Wright's house, his operation was headquartered. So Wright had gone to Tokyo because of the Tokyo Hotel, and my father worked for a while on some projects that were there, but when the work ran low, and Wright said, well, I really wish I could keep you, but I'm afraid I can't pay anything. And Neutra said, well, okay, I guess we really plan to go on to LA anyway, so thank you very much. And they left in early 1925 to drive to Los Angeles with my mother and my older brother in tow.
And your grandmother went back
and
to
my grandmother went back to Switzerland.
So making a cross-country trip at that time must have been really a long trek.
It's a big deal, yeah. I don't remember how they managed with the car, whether they bought a car or whatever, but I know they drove the last segment from Wisconsin to,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Anyway, so they arrived in Los Angeles and set up shop with Schindler. Schindler's house had been designed so it kind of would take two families with a shared kitchen in the center. And they started to work there, and at first they had a bedroom on the roof of the house with sort of a semi-protected roof area. And my mother told me that they used to have to put an oilcloth on the foot of the bed because if it rained, the water would get the foot of the bed wet. Schindler had this idea that, you know, Los Angeles is a tropical climate and you never have to heat or anything like that. He didn't realize that sometimes it gets cold in the winter. So anyway, so they camped out that way for a while, and later, many years later, I told one of the directors of the Schindler House, I said, how many people do you think can tell you exactly where they were conceived? We are sitting within 6 feet of where I think I was conceived, because we were sitting in this space on the roof where my parents had their bedroom.
I was just going to ask you, you must have come along pretty soon after that.
Yeah, I came along really the next year. In other words, they were there for a while, and they worked on the United Nations competition. I figure that's when I was conceived during that time, and then I was born shortly thereafter in October of 1926. So there's famous photos of me with my father and my mother holding me in front of the Schindler House. It's one of the famous early shots that we have.
Was it kind of understood that you would become an architect, or that you would go to college?
Well, it's an interesting story because my father had named the oldest son Frank L.
Yeah.
An obvious, thing to Frank Lloyd Wright. But my older brother was injured at birth. He had the cord wrapped around his neck and never learned to speak properly, and was challenged for the rest of his life. So he obviously couldn't be the architect. So then when I came along, their expectation was that I would be a daughter, because obviously they had the son, now it's time for the daughter. So they had a name chosen for a girl, but nothing for a boy. So when I arrived, the people in the hospital said, well, now it's been 3 days and you guys have to make a decision. We have to put something down on the birth certificate, so what is it going to be? We've been calling you Baby Neutra for 3 days. So my parents said, well, they really hadn't thought of anything, so they took my mother's name and knocked the E off of it and said, okay, let's make this Dion. So that's how I got my name. And I don't even have a middle name. I'm the only child that has no middle name.
I see.
And then ever since then, there's been a confusion. Is this person a female or a male? My mother was Diona, and I'm Dion. And I got a letter just the other day from, where was it, saying, dear Mrs. Neutra, blah, blah, blah. And I have to tell people, well, no, I'm actually male, and it's not.
Mr.
That's why my mother is not the one you're addressing here. So it's been an interesting time that the reference has been confused over the years.
So your mother actually had a musical background, and
She had a musical
her father
background.
was an engineer.
Yeah,
Your
but he
father
was
was an architect.
Yeah, but he was also a very avid pianist, a very excellent pianist, and we had a trio, the three-generation trio. I played the violin, she played cello, and my grandfather played the piano, and so we did many trios together.
So you traveled to Europe, or he came to see you?
Well, he eventually came. My father brought the family over in the 1930s, mid-30s, to reunite with their daughter. He wanted them to, have a happy retirement. They were getting older, and so he brought them over to the Strathmore Apartments in Westwood. So they lived there for many years. And during that time is when we played trio. He had a very nice thing that he did. He told them that he would like to find a place for them to live in LA, and they should send their furniture ahead, and he would try to arrange for that so when they arrived it would be ready for them. And they didn't know where this was. And he had a vacant apartment at Strathmore, so he brought all their furniture, including their grand piano and everything, and set it all up in this apartment, and brought them there from the boat to show them ostensibly this apartment building that he had designed without telling them that that's where they were going to live. So they famously arrived at this apartment and walked in and looked around, and my grandmother said, "My goodness, this is my table, this is our piano, this is my blah, blah, blah." And she was completely surprised. She was so excited to see all her furnishings disposed around this place, and everything. It was a really nice surprise, and they were very thrilled and happy and lived there for many years, very happily in that apartment.
So you had a pretty close relationship.
I did,
guess,
yeah.
with them.
As a matter of fact, later, when my parents, when I was in high school, my father was asked to be a consultant in Puerto Rico. At that time, in early 40s, we were in another depression after the war, or before the when was
before
that?
The war.
Right at the beginning of the war. You know, there was no work, no architecture to do, so he accepted this assignment to be a consultant in Puerto Rico, leaving me in LA to fend for myself as a teenager. By that time, my brother, older brother, had been admitted to the Camarillo State Hospital, and he was there being warehoused, you know, unfortunately, in that environment. So it was just me, and my grandparents moved from West LA to the VDL house, and they sort of kept me going while I was going to high school.
They moved there to help take care of the family.
Yeah, babysit and help take care of the family while my parents were out of town.
Your mother went to Puerto Rico also?
And she went to Puerto Rico
she
as well.
did.
Yeah, the two of them were there for a part of a year.
But you have a younger brother too, right?
And the younger brother had not even come into the picture by that time. He was born, let me see. No, wait a minute. Yes, he had. He was born in 1939, and they took him with them as a young.
Because he was a toddler.
He was a toddler then.
Oh, so you really were by yourself?
I was by myself. My grandparents were kind of, you know, living in the house, supposedly taking care of me, and I had an interesting childhood memory of that. My grandfather at some point decided he wanted to learn to drive. He had never learned to drive, and he was in his 60s at that time. So guess who got to be the teacher? I just got my driving license at 16. So I would go to Elysian Park, where there was a big parking lot. We would drive around, and he would practice shifting gears. You know, at those times, he had to learn how to shift gears, and it was very difficult. And I remember telling him, you know, be sure, you know, never get behind the wheel unless I'm with you, because it's illegal, and there has to be a licensed driver with you while you're learning. So one day when I came back from school at Marshall, I noticed that a neighbor's tree had been knocked down in the front lawn. Oh, no. And so that's strange. What could have caused that? So then I found out, talked to the neighbors, and said, well, your grandfather apparently got behind the wheel and drove the car up to this corner, came back down the street, lost control, and over the curb into the neighbor's yard, knocked the tree down, came down and between some other trees, got back on the street again, and somehow stopped the car after creating havoc, you know.
So I guess you were taking care of them,
And
right?
so I'm
You
supposed
were
to
more the adult.
I'm giving him this speech about you're not supposed to be doing this, you know.
Yeah.
It's really something. But he later became a pretty good driver and drove successfully for years.
So you had the family car because everybody else was gone.
Right.
And that was probably pretty unusual at that age.
Yeah, to be in the
to have a house and a car and all that freedom.
Them,
yeah. And do you remember how big your class was at Marshall High School then? Like, were there 20 or 40?
Well,
100?
I guess the graduating class was, I think, it seems to me it was close to 100 people. I'm not sure where we got all these people, but I graduated at an odd time because I had done summer school, had jumped ahead a half a grade. So I graduated in winter of 43, I guess it was. And I was just turning 18 at the time.
So a lot of your classmates
No,
were.
I was 16 at the time, and I had a year before I was going to be 18, and there was a draft, of course.
Yeah,
for the
that's what I was
service.
going to say. Yeah.
So I knew I was going to have to go in the service, so I tried to get a year in at SC before that.
Oh.
So I went to USC and applied there in architecture, and they said, well, with all your background, you can skip the first year. We'll put you right into second year right away.
Oh.
Okay, so I started in the second year, did 2 semesters there, and
then we're drafted.
and realized that I would have to go in the service. So do I want to be drafted or do I want to volunteer? I checked out the Navy. They had some programs that were long things. I think, well, let me join the Navy. I'll apply for one of these schools. One of them took 10 months. So I figured in 10 months, who knows, maybe the war will be over and I won't have to go out and get shot at. So that's what I did. I applied to enlisted in the Navy, and actually went to San Diego for basic training for 3 months, or 2 months, and then went to Chicago for some more training, and ended up in Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay for my final.
You never went overseas.
I never had to go overseas because after that I taught for a while in the program, and then I went to Alameda Naval Air Station, which is across the bay, and I mothballed the fleet. So I worked in various capacities in the Navy without ever having to go overseas. By the time I was through with my 2-year program or enlistment program, we were close to the end of the war. They offered me the opportunity to go to Bikini and participate in the atomic test program, which then offered me an increase in rate and extra incentives and 30 days leave and all kinds of good stuff. But I said, you know what? I've had enough. Thank you very much, and
You want to get back to school?
Get back to school and get back to my life. And everybody who went to Bikini ended up getting sick from the atomic
Radiation.
Radiation.
Right,
so
right.
that was a really fortunate decision.
Let me just ask you. So it was kind of understood that you would go to college.
It seemed like it, yeah. I mean, I learned at age 11, I started in the drafting room to practice drafting, and then when I went to junior high, I took drafting and got an A in the cut class because I had so much experience. Same thing when I was at Marshall. So by the time I got to SC, what else is there? But I'm signed up as an architect. So it was kind of a slow process of just getting.
They actually offered drafting at King Middle School back then?
Yeah, there was at that time. It was amazing. They had a great drafting class, and then at Marshall the same thing.
Wow.
These are all things that don't exist anymore.
Right, yeah.
It's a shame.
So you could accelerate at USC. You came back from the war and you graduated in another couple of years or so, like
well,
around
what
19...
happened after the war, when I came
49?
back, I went back to USC, and they said, well, guess what? The rules have changed. You have to take the first year now. You can't skip. You have to do all 5 years in order to get your to graduate. Okay, fine. So I went back and did my first year. And during that time, I just decided I'm going to go abroad for my third year.
Abroad,
so the question was where. So it was either Mexico City or Zurich. So Zurich won out. I decided to take German. I took a German class at SC to refresh my memory, and left for Switzerland on the Queen Mary. I still have my sticker.
Is that right?
My violin case has a sticker on it, the Queen Mary of 1946. And so I showed up in Switzerland, and with a group of 100 students called the Junior Year in Switzerland program. And I had signed up with them. It was $1,000 for 2 semesters, which is a lot of money at the time. So when I started to matriculate there, they said, there's a mistake here because we're strictly a humanities and language thing and liberal arts, whatever.
Not architecture.
The technical program is taught up the street at the ETH. I said, well, what am I supposed to do here? I paid all this money and signed up and everything with you guys. Well, I don't know. Why don't you go and check and see what they can do for you up there? So I went up there, And I introduced myself, and they said, well, you know, that's a problem. We're not really set up for this, and we don't, you know, you're a foreigner, and this is really for the nationals here to study. We could offer you what we call an auditor's program. You could audit the classes, and you could take the exams, but you couldn't graduate and you couldn't get a degree with us. But if you were interested in doing that, maybe we could make arrangements for that. I said, well, yeah, that sounds good. Can you give me a transcript? Yeah, we can give you a transcript of whatever you study. Okay, so what would this cost? Oh, this is really expensive because you're not a Swiss citizen. That's going to cost you a lot of money. It's going to cost you $32 per semester to study there instead of $500 a semester. So I said, that sounds good to me, so sign me up. So I signed up and went back down the street and said, give me my money back. So they gave me back a refund, and I had all that money left over to travel with.
To use.
Spending money.
Yeah, great.
So that worked out really well. Yeah.
Why don't we take a break for a minute, okay? And why don't we look at these pictures?
Wait.
Let me see.
So I said, well, why do that? Why don't you have them walk across on this side, people to make a left turn, and people can
And what are we looking at there?
Pardon me?
For the camera, what are we looking at? This is your plan
This
for...
is the plan for the Earl Street and Silver Lake Boulevard crossing. The city, in their wisdom, made a break in the wall here, and there's a walkway going along here, so people are supposed to walk across this intersection to get to that spot. Well, of course, without a signal and without a crosswalk, you take your life in your hands every time you do that, because there's very poor visibility, cars coming around at 40 miles an hour, and you're trying to jump across there and make that transition. So I came up with this plan suggesting that there be a signal at this corner that would allow people to make an orderly transition. Furthermore, to get the people to cross on the north segment of the intersection, so that people making a left turn could do so without having to wait for people in the crosswalk.
And what happened?
And what happened was the engineer said, well, no, we think they should be going across on the other side because that makes it inconvenient for people to make a left turn, and we don't want to encourage traffic coming down the street. This was a traffic engineer using human beings as a traffic mitigation device. People with perambulators walking across the street, you know, fighting the traffic. So anyway, this was my proposal, and also there's a chance for making a left turn pocket here, because people coming here and want to turning into this thing, the traffic backs up because there's no way to, you know, you can't get out of the way. So by rearranging the traffic lanes a little bit, I created a left turn pocket there. And then you could actually get 2 lanes here that could make left turns, and there could be a merging situation here so that the traffic could be mitigated. Because that, my thinking is this: in 5 years there's going to be a park. There's going to be more people. There's going to be more traffic. There's no doubt about it. So rather than just putting your head in the ground and saying, well, I don't like this, I don't like the thought of it, let's plan for it and actually think about what we can do.
Okay.
So that's the plan for
I
that.
see.
And
Here,
then
maybe I can turn this light on. Oh, no.
that doesn't go.
Is this
That's my mother.
your mother?
That's my mother, yeah.
I don't know. Do you want
Get
us
into
to
it? Yeah.
take this under the light, or you
I
can see it
just
pretty well?
fine.
Yeah.
And her name was Diona?
Diona, yeah, that was...
How old was she?
She was about 85 at the time. She lived to be 89. Lived in the research house until she died.
Who are these kids?
These are grandkids of mine, that my stepdaughter's children, Brett and Shannon. Shannon is just going off to college right now.
And you and your brother?
This is my older brother, Frank.
Frank L., right?
Frank L., yeah. And he lived in a, and at the end of his life lived in the valley in a sort of intermediate home. A much happier situation than the state hospital.
It was like a home where they cared for him.
Yeah, there were some Filipinos who were under that. This is my younger brother and myself.
He's quite tall.
He's quite tall, and he's
What's his name?
his name is Raymond, and
Raymond.
he's an epidemiologist who used to be in charge of the program at the state level. He's quite a high level
Is that right?
person. He just retired recently. This is my father.
What age was he here?
And he would have been in his 70s probably at that time, toward the end of his life. He lived to be 78 and died in Germany. I actually saw the location where he breathed his last, one of the houses that we designed in Wuppertal. He was photographing and had a heart attack and died right on the spot.
That's
So
right.
I got a chance to visit the house and see the present condition of it. This is me and my wife, Lynn, recently taken in the mountains. And then this is, these are my two sons, my older son, my younger son. And this is his son, Max, who is an artist, and that's me in the middle at Max's wedding.
And your older son's name is?
Is Greg, and
And
that's Nick,
Nick.
my younger son. Nick, I'm doing a house for. I got a picture of it over there in Honduras right now.
Really?
A vacation house in Honduras.
What is this?
This is the ecology garden, I call it. The research house is here. We are actually here on the corner.
Just turn it this way away from the light. Thank you, so it's
Yeah.
not so reflective.
I hope they have another two.
We're right here on the corner, and so down
Okay.
down the street in the middle is the research house.
Yes,
The lake used to be like this,
right.
so I'm trying to reconnect with water going straight out so that you look out and see water in the distance.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is a contemplation garden where you can learn about the pioneers in the ecology movement,
Oh, that's cool.
today known as the Green Movement.
Okay.
This was designed 2 weeks after my father's death in 1970, and I've been trying ever since to get the community to take on this idea of doing this plan. There's been an objection because people are afraid it's going to create traffic.
Yeah.
Well, if we have a park, we're going to have traffic anyway, so
Yeah.
I think
Plenty
we
of
might as
traffic
well
already.
we might as well get
yeah.
used to it.